68 years ago, when they were both serving in the RAF, they became good friends, and in 1960 he joined the board of AP Films as commercial director. A few years after that, he came up with the name Century 21. He played a crucial role in the marketing of all of the Super Mario Nation series, as well as UFO and Space 1999. And he was still working with Jerry during the production of Terrorhawks in the early 1980s. I think we all own books and comics and models, but our next guest licensed, or in some cases created. The toy shops of the 1960s were certainly transformed, I think, by his pioneering ideas. Please welcome to the stage our very special guest, Kieth Shackleton.
Marcus, thank you for those kind words. I think I recognize and remember the person you're talking about. But it's great to be here today, and I thank Nick and the team for inviting me. It was not in my script of life to be here, but I'm absolutely thrilled and delighted. I first met Jerry, as Marcus said, in end of 1947. We were both posted to Manston, which is an airfield on the coast between Ramsgate and Broadstairs down in Kent. Jerry had been at Bassingbourn in East Anglia. I had, prior to Manston, been at Abingdon near Oxford. And it was the time of the Berlin airlift, so we were kept very busy, flying planes night and day to keep Berlin stocked with food and all the necessities of life. It was during the Russian blockade, and our secondary activity was training Horsa glider pilots, which was also quite interesting. I had a fascinating time in the Air Force. Our main duties were split between air traffic control, which is actually on the centre of the airfield, and the direction finding, which is called a Homer in those days. That was at the edge of the airfield, and we used to get there on our bikes. So we were either on duty in the control tower or in the Homer. It was almost a young man's dream, because flying was, I know there'd been a lot of flying in the war, and a lot of the people in the war were still around, which made life very, very interesting. A couple of stories from those days, they haven't actually reached the book, but I'll deal with them anyway. Jerry and I played tennis and chess together, and we were real buddies. The in word in those days was oppo, which means opposites. But if you were somebody's oppo, you were really good friends. So Jerry was my oppo, and I think we were quite good for each other. And it worked very well, and we kept the contact going. The other thing we used to do is get up to little teenage, we were still teenagers, I think, 19, 20, teenage fun. And we used to cycle, when we were off duty, into this little pub in Margate. I can't remember the name of it, I think I could probably find it. And we'd have a game of darts, have a couple of pints, and then halfway through the evening we'd be the pianist of the day, well, the pianist of the pub arrived, and he had a special piece of theme music. You wouldn't want me to sing it to you, but it went something like this. I've been a waif, I've been a wren, I've done my bit, boys, for you so-called men, but I'm a good girl now. And it went on in that vein. So you can imagine, I regard that as schoolboy humour, and I still like schoolboy humour. Another story I might tell you, I've got 2 or 3 stories that have come to mind. Well, I will move on, and again, this story hasn't reached the book. Not many people know that Jerry and I shared a girlfriend, which is a bit unusual. Her name, you see, her name was Iris, and she used to call us regularly for these rather important and special chats. And we used to look forward to it with some, we enjoyed these chats. And this went on, throughout our time at Manston. And it wasn't something we talked about a lot because it was, it was between us. I should tell you that Iris, in fact, was the call sign of a Lancaster, which had been in the war, but they'd fitted her out with state-of-the-art communication equipment, state-of-the-art of that day. And the duty of Iris was to check you out. 1, to see whether the equipment was working, and 2, to see whether you were paying attention. I mean, the whole philosophy of being in a control tower or the Homer, you were constantly listening out for people calling up either for help, landing instructions, directions, or whatever. So and Iris used to play games. She would fly out to the most distant part of the country where the reception was, reception in those days was rated between 1 and 5. So 1 was very low. And they always tested you from the maximum range. So they put you on your mettle. So that was one of the stories of our time. I'll speak to you further when I sit down, as I'm going to in a moment. But thank you for listening. And as a famous radio broadcaster once said, thank you for listening if you were. Thank you.
Shall we? Let's bring you a little bit closer. That's great. Okay. Well, let's start by talking about Jerry. You were obviously very good friends.
Yes.
For many years.
Yes.
What qualities do you think that Jerry possessed that made him so successful? I mean, apart from his imagination.
Well, I think tenacity, I would put down. Once he came up with an idea, he would stay with it and stick with it, and probably nothing would convince him that it wasn't going to work. So he had a belief in what he was doing and what he was thinking. And he was a free thinker, so his mind was not held back by preconditioning. So he had an open mind, and he would sit and think quite a lot, I'm sure, and come up with what was, in those days, outlandish ideas. I was looking at a copy of the magazine, so I just thought of something I should have said earlier on, but I'll come back to that. A copy of the magazine was one of my grandsons, William. He was called William, he's now called Will. And he was flicking the page, and there was a picture of a watch. It's in there, and he smiled and he said, well, I got one of those, he said, and he was wearing a Motorola 360. And if you know the Motorola 360, it's almost identical to the design of this watch that we came up with in the 60s.
This is Brains' wristwatch. One that you could actually get a picture, you could talk to people on it. Yes.
If you look at that, it's very similar to the Motorola 360. Yes. So I think we should be charging them a royalty for using
strange things about that.
Yes. I remember, the very first time I met Jerry, he met me at Reading Station, and we went back to his place, and he gave me a lift in his Lexus, I remember, and I heard a noise, and it was his mobile phone ringing, and it was Mary, his wife, calling him.
Yes.
And as he was driving along, he pressed a button like that, and this device just produced his mobile and flipped it over like that. And I said, Jerry, I've never seen that before. And he said to me, yes, he said, I invented that. I invented that, and I told Lexus about it. And do you know what I got? He said, Mary got a bunch of flowers. I said, that was the best. That was the best we got. So he was still inventing things, you know. He was a man ahead of his time. How did he... you were obviously friends before you joined AP Films. How did you come to join AP Films?
Well, Jerry and I used to meet off and on for a drink and a chat throughout the 50s. Well, I had a fascinating 50s. I had a couple of jobs. The one I like to remember, I was assistant business manager, a very important person, to a company called Industrial and Trade Fairs, half owned by the Financial Times and the other half owned by the Daily Mirror. Two unlikely bedmates, but it worked. And we had a managing director, I can see him now, Kieth Shackleton, great imagination, great energy. And we did some very interesting things. We did the first we did some of the British participation in Brussels in 1958. That was the Atomium, and it was I think it was the first World Trade Fair after the war. So we did that. Also in 58, we hired a Viscount, filled it half full of businessmen, half full of the press. We were sponsored by the Board of Trade, and we flew off to Rome, guests of the Italian government, and believe it or not, we were going to set up a World Trade Center in Mussolini's Marble Palace, which still exists south of Rome. And we were feted and dined by the Italians. We were still on rations in this country. I'd never seen so much food in all my life, and they gave us a wonderful time. We had lord-ins with the Pope, but that's another story. It was a great... It didn't happen. We got back, and about 6 weeks later, Sharon called us together and said, gentlemen, got some good news and some bad news. Bad news is Italy is not going to happen, but we're going to Moscow. And then we put the first British Fair in Moscow in 1960 together. So we were on a roll. That was almost the Thunderbirds of this company, high spot. I had an interesting immediate boss. He'd been in the Marines during the war. He used to sleep on his trousers to maintain the crease, and for shaving he'd use his boots. He polished his boots so shiny you could actually see your face in it for almost. But anyway, he was having a tough time. We acquired another company. It was almost a carbon copy of what happened to Century 21 in the 60s. And there wasn't a natural match. So on balance, the two things destroyed, to my mind, the flavour and ethos of the company. So on the second or third time of asking, Jerry said, come and join our outfit. I said, I don't know a thing about what you're doing, but he finally hit me on the spot when I was getting disenchanted with what I was doing. So I rang my wife, who's somewhere here today, I hope. And I must tell you, while I'm thinking of my wife, 3 weeks ago, oh there she is, I can see her. We celebrated 61 years of marriage, so I'm very proud to say that. So I phoned my wife and I said, I've made a decision. I think I may have done something stupid. She said, what's that? I said, well, I'm joining a company called AP Films. And I joined them, and I thought I was done my homework. It was a great bunch of people, but the company was totally undercapitalized, and we were struggling. They just finished making the cowboy series,
Four Feather Falls.
Four Feather Falls, for Granada, and we thought that was the pathway to stardom. In fact, it wasn't. We sat there, and it wasn't until, and I can't think of his name, but a Good Samaritan introduced us to Lou Grade. And Jerry came back and said, we've got a meeting with Lou Grade. And we said, would you come along with me? And I said, sure. And we went and met the great man. Jerry had got the deal for a new series in place, but we went along. And Lou used to give interviews that lasted, I won't say precisely, 2.5 minutes or thereabouts, because he'd said all he had to say, all he wanted to say, in 2.5 minutes, and that's how it went on with the meetings with the grand man. So that's how I came to join AP Films, and it's as simple or as complicated as that.
Your first great success, I mean, you were the commercial director, weren't you?
Yes.
At AP Films, and you had your own company, AP Films Merchandising.
Right.
Oh, here we can see an advert for it, in fact. Now your first major success, the first of many major successes, was the Supercar Club.
Yes.
I believe. Tell us about that.
Yes. Well, we got a few licenses. It was a tough sell. I used to go cold calling. Couldn't do it today. And most calls you made, you were politely received, and it was a learning curve. There was one particular call, I can't remember the company, I know the concept, and they were less than courteous, I won't say more than that. And I came away, I said, no, I wouldn't behave like that. Anyway, I went away. So one morning I was out, I used to cycle in those days. Well, I still cycle, but on a tricycle, but that's another story. I used to go cycling, and I found that as a platform for inspiration. And I thought, what do we do to promote Supercar? We'd got a comic strip with TV Comic, which was doing quite well. And I thought, let's do a Supercar Club. And we came up with a simple concept of a pilot's license and a little badge.
And here is the badge.
That's the badge. And it's futuristic, isn't it? And so we put the package together. I found a manufacturer. I went to the jewellery quarter in Birmingham, where they make such things as this, and I excited them with the idea. We got some designs out, and we put some in production. And the pilot's license was a question of writing some suitable copy for it and having it designed. And then we took space in TV Comic. The subscription in those days was £0.50, which was a significant amount of money. And in the first 3 weeks of advertising, with 2 or 3 ads, we had 70,000 members. And it was all handled, the company is around the corner, I mean, they're probably gone now, but from Maidenhead. They were, I think, a mail order company, and we used their resources. They were our mailing address, and they were having, they couldn't believe it. Sacks of mail were arriving by the hour, and it really went on fire. It took off in a big way. So that was a